How's everyone doing? Welcome back. Hope you guys enjoyed lunch. So we're going to kick it off. This is the Future of VR panel. I'm Nate Mitchell, VP of Product at Oculus. To my left here, we have Palmer Luckey, founder of Oculus. You guys all know him pretty well. We have John Carmack, CTO at Oculus. Ottman Binstock, Chief Architect at Oculus. For those of you that don't know Ottman is one of the driving forces behind the Crescent Bay prototype and a lot of the demo scenes that you guys saw in the Crescent Bay experience today. And then, of course, woo! And then we have Michael Abrash, Chief Scientist at Oculus. Cool. So I wanted to kick things off. Round of applause for Michael. Do we want that? So I wanted to kick things off. It's actually been just over 2 years since the Virtual Insanity panel that Michael, John, and Palmer, you guys were all on at QuakeCon 2012. And Michael, you actually talked a lot about how at that moment you thought it was the seminal point for VR. So a lot's happened in 2 years. What's your take?
I understated it vastly. I could never have imagined, truly. This is just kind of like, this is 10 times as fast as I thought it would happen and 10 times as promising. So at that time, I think if I could go back, I would have said, well, I'm saying this, and I hope I'm right. And I got lucky.
Cool. So we're just going to dive into a number of questions. We actually took a number of questions from the internet ahead of this talk. We're going to try to take some live. And then at the end of the talk, in the last 15 minutes, we'll take some questions live from the audience. So I'm just going to open it up to all of you. What do you guys consider to be the missing link for VR outside of the visual improvements that we're seeing?
I think controllers are one of the huge topics, and I am happy I'm not working on that. I've said that a few times to people here, where the things that I'm putting most of my effort on are quantifiable things that I can put a wrench on and declare victory at some point, but controllers is such an open-ended and factious and contentious issue that it's not going to be exactly clear when somebody really wins that one.
Yeah, making VR inputs hard because unlike making a traditional gamepad or headphones or even a head-mounted display, there's no clear path towards what is best. And I don't even think people have identified all of the problems that we're going to need to solve. And you won't be able to identify them until you reach a certain level of quality and interaction and content that you can use to gauge these things.
I'd go a little farther, which is to say there is an existence proof, which is you use your hands to manipulate things. But there's no clear path to how you could reproduce that experience in VR right now with any technology we see.
So anything you...
No, go ahead.
Well, so because of that, anything that you do is going to be some approximation that tries to get part of the way there, and you have to decide, kind of like we were talking about in Narav's talk yesterday about when we shipped DK1, there were some things that we knew were bad, but they were less bad than the things we did right. And input's going to be a lot like that too. We are going to know that things are wrong. We're going to know that you can't perfectly emulate how you interact with the real world, but there'll be clear wins.
But at the same time, it's more powerful than just saying you need to control things, which obviously you do. It's that if you're going to be present, you need the loop where you see something, you reach for it, so there's a motor control, and then as you get close to it, there's some kind of interaction. If it's your hands, if it's controllers, whatever, you need to close that loop so there's a feedback from what you're seeing back through your actions and then back through your senses again. And we have to figure out how to produce that, even though we can't give you what you're used to.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if we need exactly the same level of fidelity for the hands that we need for the head tracking, where it wasn't obvious to a lot of people that sub-millimeter really was a necessity for the head tracking. And it's an open question right now. Can we get by with something a little bit looser with the hands? Probably to some degree. But the sense of demos where you're controlling things with your hands, but it's not really locked in. It's that same sense of the really bad early VR demos where you're using your head as a controller, not believing that you're looking around in the virtual space. And controllers and tracking is going to fight a lot of that thing until it gets to at least a roughly similar level of quality. But the payoff is, of course, that most of the time when you put somebody, especially like a younger child or something, in VR, it just inevitably, it's this, you want to see your hands. It's so important, and we've got nothing there right now.
Yeah, I think it's clear that everyone has this vision that just having your hands work is an end goal for VR input, but it's not clear what the sweet spots are along from here to there, and that's a long ways away. I do think that there is a thing that's called hand presence when you feel like your hands are really there in VR, and it probably is sort of a terrifying amount of precision and tracking.
You know, it is kind of interesting how VR was originally gloves and goggles, and nobody talks about gloves anymore. It's like that was probably not one of the right ideas, but it was looked at as so critical at that point 20 years ago, but now it's, you know, it's almost overlooked.
I'll also add that in like a lot of the testing that we've done with input, you know, kind of like how it surprised us how accurate you have to be with the head to make it really good. The same is true for the hands, not just for immediately apparent errors. Like even if it looks like it's working right, having any kind of latency makes it feel like your hand is dead or reacting incorrectly, and that's actually a very unpleasant feeling. And then you can easily tell if you do something like clap, and then you can feel yourself clapping, but then the vision side lags.
And now there's a really important
obvious
aspect to that that's also not real obvious, where so many of the things that we're doing with latency, with time warp and things like that are not going to help with that visual effect of something coming in there. That needs to run through the whole pipeline.
Because it has to process the entire thing, and these hands may be moving in different ways across, you know, another scene that we're also warping.
Yeah, so do we wind up cutting some new path in there for some actual late rendering of geometry rather than just warping for something else that needs to be sub 20 milliseconds interaction on that, which we can't do for any other general purpose aspect right now.
And it's not just that the timing has to be right. I mean, I don't know if you were there, Palmer, but these people all saw the McGurk effect. And the thing about the McGurk effect is not that the audio and the video showed up at the same time. It's that what your brain did with them was something different than it would have done with either of them independently. And similarly, when you clap and you hear this, it's not just that the sound and the feel show up and the visual show up all at the same time. It's that your brain actually takes them and makes an experience out of them that is more vivid and more real. And you know, if the latency is off, it's just not going to fuse that way, and you're not going to have that experience.
Well, talking about clapping, actually, we talked a lot about audio and the importance of audio for great VR, as you know, Brendan's keynote this morning. What do you guys think, you know, improvements need to be made there, and what sort of impact does audio have on the experience on the whole?
Well, you know, we still have this argument internally at the company about like how many people are going to wear headphones versus not wear headphones on Gear VR, or what they're going to do in different VR stuff. And you know, one of the points that I made was just troll YouTube for Rift stuff on how many people didn't put on the headphones. So it's still a hard thing, and I'm super happy that we did decide finally for the integrated audio, because if it's not integrated absolutely as a part of it, it's not going to be an important part. I'm hoping now that we do have it integrated on at least one of our product lines going forward, that it will get that attention. But as a game developer, you know, to the audio engineers out there, decades have gone by where they've always gotten the short end of the stick. They always get the smallest time slice of the CPU, and they don't really get to do the things that they want to do, because honestly, we tried them and they didn't pan out that much. But I do think that VR is the time that all that audio stuff that everybody always wanted to do and we never thought made the grade for traditional gaming, now it can actually make a difference. But it's going to be interesting to see how much of the things from the audio, how much of it is just the head tracking on the positional audio or the interaction of the different things in there. And we don't really know yet. That's something where nobody's built that perfect demo yet. And that is sort of Oculus's responsibility to evangelize this by making the demo that makes it so blatantly obvious to everyone that this is an important aspect.
I think it's going to be more than an important aspect. I think it's going to be a force multiplier. And it's illustrative of something that's happened with VR, which is there are a lot of technologies that are cool, but they're just not that important, because what would you use them for? So I talked about scene reconstruction, which is something there's been a lot of research on. You can take 2 million flicker photos and you can build a model of the Colosseum or whatever. It's amazing and it's cool. What do you do with a model of the Colosseum? But with VR, you want to be in that model of the Colosseum. And similarly, if audio is really good, if it's properly spatialized, if it's properly propagated so that the space of the room you're in feels right, you won't even know why, but the experience will be far, far more real, and you'll experience a lot more presence. So up to this point, making audio a lot better would have fairly low incremental returns. But I think with VR, it's going to have huge returns.
I think as far as evangelism, one of the best ways to evangelize is not just to make the gain apparent to every user, because many users it won't be necessarily consciously apparent. Like you said, they may not even realize it, but one of the strongest ways we can evangelize is by forcing people to do the right thing. And putting audio on the headset kind of forces everybody into at least trying to use that. So it makes it the default. The default is using it with good audio, and then they have to consciously try and break that. And I think that there's going to be a lot of people who maybe do consciously move away from that because a lot of people have brand loyalty, or they already have audio gear that they may or may not think is better, that may or may not be better. But right now, the whole gaming headphone industry it's pretty uniformly terrible, and they're all terrible in different ways. So if you're an audio designer, having to design for a wide range of differently terrible headsets is a pretty big challenge. And so having a fixed set, high-quality audio set of hardware that you can target, I think is going to be a really, really cool thing.
Yeah, like I was actually disappointed where Sony's original HMZ T1 had, I thought, a pretty good mechanical design for the integrated audio, but they were such low quality and everybody panned them so much for it. I was afraid that that poisoned the well, that people were going to say, integrated audio, it sucked in this case, therefore, we shouldn't be pursuing that because the market has spoken, they don't want that.
And it really doesn't need to suck. A lot of the cost in the audio industry in particular is going to marketing overhead and getting these things out there. But it doesn't actually cost all that much to make pretty good audio. If you're selling it as part of something else, which is pretty cool.
Cool.
Wait, one more thing. I just wanted to see if anyone else had anything to say. One of the things I'm really excited to see is that you were talking earlier about dynamic brightness and being able to have this really wide range that you could potentially have at a head-mounted display versus in the past on traditional displays. I think that there could be something kind of similar in audio that makes it useful because it's not just targeting a bunch of different hardware, it's also targeting a lot of different volume levels that all sound different on different headphones. So normally if you're working on a piece of content where you have really loud explosions and then also ambient sounds, you really have to compress those into a narrower range than reality because most people are not going to have the explosions actually at full volume. They'll turn it down so that the loudest things are at a comfortable volume, and then you just wash out all of the stuff that's quieter. But if you know someone has they have a certain audio headset, potentially you can make things where you almost have it like a fixed brightness, having kind of a fixed volume, where if a game developer wants something to be louder, they actually have to make it louder up at the top of the capabilities of the headset, and then that way you know that all the ambient noise is also going to be at the real world level.
Right, like how we can do brightness as an absolute scale rather than relative when we can factor out the ambient lighting. And another aspect on audio, though, like one of the points that Hook mentioned that I thought was really interesting is that, of course, you could still use your giant thumping subwoofer there where you just want to cross over on that because that doesn't get spatialized, and you'd still want the mid and high ranges spatialized properly through the headphones, but you can still have some large physical device moving a lot of air for you at the low end.
And subwoofers actually aren't even that expensive. I was talking with him, and I went out and looked for the cheapest subwoofer I could find, and it was, I don't remember the brand, but it was some terrible no-name 2.1 speaker set where they all light up all blue, acrylic, and gamer speakers.
Yeah.
But it was $50 including shipping for a little sub and 2 speakers. And so I ordered one, and it actually was it's pretty cool what you can get for, what must have been a sub that cost, low tens of dollars.
What do you guys think are the most interesting challenges facing virtual reality? This was a common question that came up, and I think most people are interested in either technical or otherwise.
I think actually delivering compelling experiences and not making people sick, making them really comfortable in VR is the first challenge ahead of us. And I believe it's possible. I think we've demonstrated some of that. And having a mass market economy of users who desire experiences that are compelling in VR that are not things where most people are going to be really unhappy will let it become a much bigger ecosystem and a bigger audience. And I think that is the first real challenge, delivering the hardware capabilities and getting the developers to make these experiences.
I think one of the things that that becomes more obvious when you try to use VR to convey textual information, to read something on it, is how bad our optics actually are when you try to cover the whole visual field and read something that has high contrast. So the fact that optics is such an awful mess of trade-offs there, and I still think that display technology can wind up helping this by conforming the display to the optics. And even if our resolution didn't change, the advancements that we could get by having optics that were really great across the entire field of view and did proper pixel fusion, there's a lot to be gained there on a completely orthogonal axis to the raw resolutions or refresh rates of the displays.
Nothing from you, Palmer?
I already talked about what's exciting.
So the thing here is, though, that there are half a dozen different axes that VR can get a lot better on. And so to pick one, I mean, I think really input is the most immediate one there. And as Ottman says, motion sickness. But really, pick any one of these areas and say, OK, we don't actually know how to do them, but we know how to make a lot of progress on them in the near future. And so you could say input, you could say audio. You could say display in several ways. Hey, depth of field alone,
yeah,
right? I mean, who knows how it would be if we had good depth of field, because we can't even prototype that right now. And tracking. Tracking in computer vision. So is this where I get to say, if you're a computer vision researcher and you want to come work with me, please let me know? Because tracking everything, tracking your head, your hands, your body, your eyes, your facial expressions, making it so that you can get up and walk around safely. I mean, you know, John talked about standing up while you do this. There's only one downside, and that's that you might actually just step on something or fall over things. So how do you solve that problem? How do you reach out and pick up real objects? There's this whole constellation of tracking things. So everywhere you look in VR, there's like this great long road of fascinating stuff to figure out.
I do think that input is one of the, you said there's a half dozen different paths, but input's one of the more obvious ones. Not even because it's most clearly the biggest win compared to audio or walking around or better optics or anything. It's because it's clearly obvious to consumers. It's the type of thing where, yes, great optics across the whole field or conforming displays or having better audio or depth of field. Those are all really great, really important things, but they're not immediately apparent to consumers, and they're not going to, as long as input isn't there, people will say, where's my hands?
And that shows how you can't really separate these, because if you want to do this, you have to have tracking,
yes,
right? And if you want to, for example, do foveated rendering, you have to have eye tracking. So again, it's not a reductionist problem. You can't say, I'm just going to fix this one thing.
So about, excuse me, eye tracking. One of the most common questions that came up for you guys was just about what the future of eye tracking looks like. Why haven't we seen a low-cost, low enough latency solution yet? And when can we expect to see something like that integrated into the Rift?
So there's two aspects to eye tracking that it could be used for. Using it just to determine depth of field has the simpler aspect where all you need to know is how the pair of eyes are, whether they're straight ahead or converging, and you could determine a depth of field based on not a whole lot of information there, and not necessarily having to be particularly fast. It's an interesting question whether that would even be a positive thing, though. In VR, of course, everything is in equal focus. In the real world, things are in variable focus. But is that actually a good thing in the real world? Do we want to even emulate that in VR? And sometimes, like in game rendering, when I see people emulating the negative aspects of film rendering or of film in some way, I wonder the same thing. It's like, should we be happy with VR that is in some ways better than reality with an infinite depth of field or not? But then the more powerful and more important aspect for the eye tracking is how we can do foveated rendering, where right now it's probably not even a good idea, because if you're only rendering 1K something eye buffers, a lot of current systems will wind up sucking up more in overhead if you make another pass through it to render 2 views per eye. But there's paths in hardware API interfaces that we can start eventually rendering, push the scene once, get 4 views out of it, exactly how you want to compose it. And when we're at 4K displays, that's going to clearly make good sense to do that, and we want it to go even beyond that. So as Michael pointed out there, what you really want is this incredible 16K by 16K space, and we're not getting that. You can count out how long it's going to take Moore's Law to get there. So clearly we want foveated rendering. It seems an easier problem than catching 3 orders of magnitude or something on all these different improvements. So I'm excited to see some more of this, but yeah, there's a half dozen companies that are pitching stuff there, and as far as we can tell, none of them are really quite usable for our needs yet.
Cool.
Although, just to add on, there is the other use, which is just pure, you look at something and it shoots in that direction, like just a pure UI tool, apart from the core virtual reality experience improvements. And that's pretty tough, too, because you want to have a solution that can really do everything. You don't want to build it in just as a cool UI tool, especially because even the best stuff out there right now, you have to design game it's almost a constraint for your design. Like there's nothing so accurate that you could like look at something and reliably have, you know, a bullet go right through that point. You could do stuff like intelligent auto aim to know which person you're aiming at.
And of course, figuring out how you do the intentional action. You know,
Yes.
you know, selection is obvious there, but how do you do action? You know, staring intently is a little bit harder to pull out.
So it ends up almost
That's the murder in their eyes.
yeah. And it could potentially be a design constraint that actually doesn't add as much as people would think. And it could be better that eye tracking, you know, it could be that eye tracking isn't worth doing until you can do it really well for all of these things.
If you have lower quality eye tracking, you may be able to drive avatar eyes so that I can see that you're looking at me or looking over there.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Even with a low quality version.
Well, if you want to be in virtual space with another person, the place you start is eyes. We're just incredibly sensitive to that.
And there's actually, I forget who did it, but there was a study that was published, it was shown at IEEE VR a couple years back on real avatar eye tracking versus simulated eye tracking. And the idea was to try to figure out the intent of the user. You know, if they're looking roughly at you, is it probably right? And then if you have two heads that are close together, what if, you know, virtually it says, I'm looking at you, but I'm also going to snap the eyes occasionally over to him every once in a while. And I don't know where my eyes are pointing. And to you guys, as long as what I'm doing appears plausible, it's not actually, it doesn't matter if it's actually correct. And then another part of that was they had a mirror. And if you looked in the mirror, they tried the real eye tracking where it looked at your eyes and pointed them in the mirror. The problem is the eye tracking actually has, you know, all kinds of real problems. Like accuracy and then trying to get it in just the right place. Whereas the simulated eye tracking, they said, well, if he's looking right in the mirror, let's just point his eyes directly at his eyes in the mirror. And then no matter how you move, it looks like they're just perfectly moving, much faster than you ever could with the entire loop of an eye tracking camera in there. And then if you look somewhere else, like let's say I'm looking at the mirror, but then I move my eyes to look over to the left, then I can't see that my eyes are pointing in the correct position anymore. So it could lead to some strange stuff, but I think that as long as it's a plausible action, you may be able to get around a lot of the avatar stuff.
2 mirrors would screw you up.
2 mirrors would definitely screw it up, yes.
So going back to input for a second, one of the other top questions in terms of technology was around haptics. And just, you know, we haven't seen, well, Palmer, you could speak to this probably better than the questions can, but we haven't seen that many advancements in haptics. And how important is haptics for VR?
I disagree. I think we're seeing a lot of advancements in haptics. They're not just generally not virtual reality focused. You know, the Holy Grail is something that can exert force, you know, back on you. You reach out and you hit an object and it actually stops you there. But we don't have any kind of technology like that, at least now on a consumer level, that can simulate a wide variety of things like we can do with the visual or audio system. So you've got approximations where, you know, you've got shaking hands and rumble motors, and then you've got some cooler stuff like LRAs in the piezoelectric.
So what have you seen on the really high end?
Well, the really high end is they actually do make like many multi-axis, multi-motor arms that actually give you feedback, and these are usually used in very high-end professional simulators. Like one that I've seen, it teaches people who are building aircraft carriers like how to use welding tools and stuff, and you can actually like run it up against stuff and you know, either pound it or draw a fine bead, and it's very cool stuff. But like precision electromechanical devices haven't gotten all that much cheaper over the last few decades. It's still very expensive. So I'd say that's the most cutting edge. But I'm not aware of anyone doing that for consumers really well.
I think haptics is very important and very hard, very, very hard. I think what might be more trackable in the medium term is another tracking problem, which is pulling tangible objects into VR. So, I mean, as simple as your coffee mug, so you know how to pick it up so you can drink from it. Your keyboard would really be handy, right? But all kinds of objects. And if you do that, you get haptics for free. So that's one way that I think it could be approached in the near term. But haptics is the hardest of the problems as far as I'm concerned.
Like if you had a banana and you picked it up, and then you could have it actually show up in the virtual space. Now you have a banana, and then maybe you cut it apart and it's still a banana. Then you've got this great haptic eating feedback. That's how we're going to simulate taste.
That's right. That's a hard tracking problem, though. It is.
Need those computer vision engineers if they're in the audience.
I just want to one more thing. One of the first things that we were doing when we started doing position tracking was we had like the little cubes floating around, and we were just going around pretending to eat them, and we're like, wow, that could, because you can't see it once it goes here. We're like, That's almost something that you could think that could be a gameplay mechanic. VR Pac-Man or something.
There's a game waiting to happen there.
It's like eating bubbles, because you can't really taste them or feel them. Okay.
Getting away from bubbles. Can the panel discuss their thoughts a bit on the prospects and challenges of social VR?
So we actually, in the last 6 months, we took a little quick stab with Gear VR to try to get in the basic social aspects of getting voice communication and getting a trivial avatar body with head and eyes and the basic stuff there. And we couldn't get enough done in enough time to make it part of the shipping experience. But of the couple things that are the top flight most important things as we go post-launch, getting that multi-user experience there is our most important sort of user visible feature. So it's clearly a hugely important thing. And I think it's oddly somewhat it's a little surprising that more hasn't been done in the VR community so far. I mean, yes, there's a number of things that are neat that people have done, but that it's not a more core mechanic, it was a little surprising. And I guess as the basics mature and people understand how to do the general thing about moving your view around, I expect something more of that to be going on. Although there was an interesting thing that Mark Zuckerberg mentioned when we were talking about that, about how much interaction winds up not being synchronous, but instead asynchronous. The whole leaving a note for someone and interacting with people in ways that don't necessarily have all those critical real-time interactions about keeping the eye tracking and everything working exactly right. But clearly it's going to be the largest, most important part of VR. I mean, people aren't going to be doing these things completely in isolation.
And that's been one of the interesting differences between playing games and what people actually do in real life. Like what people do in real life, there are people who go, hiking all on their own or taking pictures all on their own. But I think most people participate in activities along with other people. And sometimes that can make even really kind of terrible, boring activities really interesting because of the whole social interaction aspect. Like, I don't think checkers is a very good game. I mean, it's a very simple game. It's a solved game. You can actually memorize the set of ways to win, and then it's not even a game anymore. It's just who goes first. And despite that, people still play together because it's not the checkers that engages people. It's the human dynamic and being on the other side of someone that you're trying to outwit. And I think that bringing that into virtual reality can be more powerful than just the kind of multiplayer gaming that you normally have, which is people are talking on voice chat, but for most games, you're effectively on your own. You're running around the map on your own, or you're moving with other people, but you don't intuitively know that's a person that's actually right next to me, and we're doing this thing together. So
yeah, and that should be one of the real. Okay, the first major challenge for VR is don't get sick. But one of the next major ones is going to be that sense of empathy, when you can really relate to the person as an actual person. And that's going to be a really big deal. I mean, that's one of those large-scale social issues. But I have seen some kickback from some people that are like, don't talk to me about social and multi-user in VR. I want my virtual world. So there is an element like that really wants to make sure that they can have the world to themselves.
Maybe we can connect all those people. We'll just dump them into a box. The antisocial box. Okay, I shouldn't have said that.
All good. Do either of you guys want to comment?
I already said what I thought about this,
Sure.
which is I think this is the biggest thing that's going to happen in VR.
Palmer said it better than I can.
All right.
The box?
So I know that this panel is the future of VR, but another one of the most common questions asked was, what's your guys' latest take on augmented reality? As much as we feel free to talk about here on this panel.
I think augmented reality is someday going to be very important. I mean, John and I were talking about this earlier, and John said, hey, I want that information all the time. And once it's there, people will want it. I think augmented reality is harder to do well than VR is. VR is clearly tractable at this point. It's not clear to me that augmented reality is tractable to an extent that would make it genuinely useful yet.
I mean, one of the accomplishments that I pat myself on the back for is talking Michael out of AR into VR.
I give John full credit for that one.
Well, like you said, there's that VR is clearly tractable versus AR. And I'd say that, not really disagreeing, but there are clearly things we will be able to do in AR, like additive AR, where you put things over the environment in some some general way. But the things you really want to be able to do with AR, you need to be able to subtract from the environment as well and bring virtual elements in a really cool way. You know, that's how you can do all the cool things, like putting people who aren't there in the real space, or erasing the people you don't like, or real world ad block. But as long as the state of the art is just adding more glowing information to the world, it's not going to be able to do what.
Well, that's going to be the interesting thing: is does it wind up that pass-through winds up being the way that AR actually works in the end? You know, if we get our in-goal VR sunglasses in some way, and we have planoptic light field cameras lining the front of it there, then that might be the path. We might back into the path that solves AR more than a lot of the complicated optical directions that things are going to now.
And that certainly would be fascinating if it ended up being that was the better visual path than going for an optically transparent system and then trying to solve all the problems with that. Particularly if, like you said earlier, there's some things in VR that potentially we don't even want to emulate. It'd be very interesting if you don't just get AR benefits, but you also get real-world benefits.
You get your superpowers. You want your telescopic and microscopic vision that you can turn on will. Yeah.
Also, and if you build up a good enough database of all the objects around you, you can have kind of a proto X-ray vision where you can see through walls, you know, through to, oh, I see the path goes over the hotel through that wall.
Yeah.
Be interesting.
Hang on a second, everybody. I'm picking the next question here. Another question that came through actually a lot was, do we think that perfect VR, which is indistinguishable from reality, will be attainable in our lifetime? And obviously, we've talked about some of the biggest barriers, but that was sort of the follow-up, is what are the biggest barriers?
Well, you know, indistinguishable from real life, one point that I sometimes bring up when we're talking about how precise optical distortion has to be right is that you can be real life suffering various levels of artifacts. You know, if you're looking out a car windshield or through a screen door, you're perceiving reality in the real world, but not necessarily at the peak fidelity under the best of conditions. And I think that it has been, you know, it's been rewarding to watch real-time rendering get to the point over the last couple decades where now there are, even in real time, some things with limited cases where you can say, this is photorealistic, it's indistinguishable. And the offline rendering now is just getting crazy hard to distinguish between real and false there. But so I think that it always winds up being this set of conditions. Like we went through all of this in gaming, where you can take your simplest cases where you've got a room made of nothing but diffuse reflectors and rectilinear surfaces, and you start really simple, and you say, okay, we can nail this to some level, but the vibrant rainforest jungle in a rainstorm or something is going to be way, way, way harder to get there. So it's not a bright, sharp line that you cross and you're done. It's something that, it's a huge spectrum that you slowly creep over. And I think that, like, the ability to say something, a system, I guess it's almost like a Turing test that you take at that point of real versus synthetic, but the idea of having a head-mounted display, and if you were given the option of actually taking the lenses out and viewing a real world through it versus having the lenses in and seeing a synthetic world, or not making the lenses non-distorting so they were still seeing through glass, that type of test where I suspect that within a decade, in simple, contrived cases, or your Cornell box of virtual reality, that we probably will be able to do something that could be visually indistinguishable, that could fit under the response thresholds of perceptibility, that might be missing something much more important that not aware of, but for the simplest cases, it's probably possible. I'd be curious to see if you'd agree with that.
So I agree about the visuals. I also think it should be possible with audio. I also think it's possible with smell, and if it hadn't been for smell-o-vision, smell would be a less amusing topic. But I mean, let's face it, we've got something that's right next to your nose, and it only takes a few thousand molecules.
But isn't it the case with olfactory and taste that there's no way to synthesize that, where there's no additive combination like
Correct.
RGB or waveforms?
As far as I know, but
so you need a library.
It's not an inkjet printer with 3 heads. Let's just put it that way. Maybe 1,000 heads. But you don't necessarily have to have all the smells to have. It's just what you're saying with visuals, which is you're not trying to do everything perfectly. The question is, can you do anything really convincingly? But then you get into vestibular, haptics, right? How are you going, kinesthetic, how are you going to do those? And it's not going to be a robot arm. I'm pretty confident about that. I mean, that just isn't tractable. It's not going to be some kind of omnidirectional treadmill. So and really the hard one is, how are you going to do vestibular?
So right? How are you thinking about neural stim nowadays? Like direct neural stimulation or sensing?
Are you talking about like directly stimulating the vestibular organs, or are you talking about jacking into the
Anything in
matrix?
general. I mean, like, we'll see the parts of sensing, sensing motions directly coming out first, but the different ways of poking at the brain in more direct fashions than through our external actuators.
Well, I mean, that'll be interesting to see, but we have to understand how those systems
You're
work.
the one zapping people's galvanic.
But I mean, even galvanic vestibular stimulation is really kind of a crude trick. It's not really. We figured it out over 100 years ago. A guy stuck some wires from a battery in his ears and fell over. That's actually anecdotally what happened. And so it's a really crude trick. It's a long way from that to being able to simulate all of the accelerations and movement, much less the vision and the audio that you'd want to have for direct.
But we are seeing exciting things for the blind and deaf people that are getting direct neural stimulation on things, but can it be done in a non-destructive way or a way that doesn't require it to be gone in the first place?
Well, it's non-destructive and also a quality line. Like something that was that I think you mentioned earlier was that people, if they're not a believer and if they try something that really gives them a sense of presence, then they'll be converted and say this is a thing worth using. Even if we can get something working, that replaces your eye, even if it's non-invasive. The quality has to be at a certain level, and the level for using that technology is much higher for me or you than for a blind person. Yeah. Because for them, almost anything is going to be an improvement.
A 10 by 10 grid of pixels is great if you had zero before.
You can know when it's morning or night, and you can see some movement, but we have to understand how the system works, and people ask me all the time, when are we going to see neural stimulation? Like, can we predict it? Or other people say, oh, well, it's clear that there's a path to it. And I don't think that there's any clear path to it.
But the point I keep coming back to, though, is it's so painful that the bandwidth of your optic nerve out of your eye is way less than your monitor cable. Yep. And the fact that we have these orders of magnitude more that we need to come up through to get this external stimulation and then throw away 99.99% of all of it.
Well, you get into these weird sci-fi scenarios, like there's a lot of sci-fi where the currency of the future is the drugs that allow for, like the anti-rejection drugs that allow for implants and stuff, and we still haven't even figured out how to implant basic stuff in people without using all kinds of complicated medicine to keep them alive and working well. So we'll see. I kind of think of it the same way. I think of people talk about reaching the singularity. I think there's people who believe that it could happen maybe someday. There's people who believe we can prove it will happen someday, and people who think we can, going back to the question, prove it will happen within their lifetimes. And I don't think that for the singularity or for this that there's a path where we can prove today that it will happen within our lifetimes. I also want to, you mentioned, well, both of you, like there's all of these different things like the vestibular system and tracking your body and all that, but you could probably come up with an artificial scenario where you could simulate not just like a room from the vision side. Like imagine if the simulation was that you're in a room that has no movement, no sound except yourself breathing, and no scent, and you're in a straitjacket, really tight straitjacket. Potentially you could even simulate that experience pretty closely.
Well, if you put yourself in an anechoic chamber with the lights off, you can nail that one.
We win.
Oh, right? Floating in a tank. Floating.
Well, but maybe you don't even need the lights off because you're simulating you wearing a VR headset. So the light leakage it's all part of the sim.
But, I mean, the truth of this is that this is kind of on the other side of the divide you talk about a lot, which is that there are things that seem within reach, and those are interesting. There are things that are not within reach, which are interesting to think about, right? They're sort of two different categories. And this one, who knows? What I do think is that as VR becomes more widely used, there'll be more incentive to look into these things. Right now, there isn't really, I mean, there are blind people, so you can help them, but it's not like 1 billion people are going to start using this technology if you came up with it today. But once VR is widely used, then there's more incentive to do that kind of research. And who knows where it'll lead.
I think something that actually is in reach is not perfect VR, even for a limited experience, but an experience where people just forget that it's VR and they believe it's real. And for that technology and that experience that delivers it, I think that'll be achievable within our lifetime relatively soon.
Yeah, that's not even that far off. And cartoon worlds can be fine things to do for experiences, and knowing that you can shave many orders of magnitude off the difficulty of the problem by making creative decisions, those become pretty valuable.
So on the creative front, actually, we have a room full of developers here. What sort of recommendations would you give to everyone actually building content for VR, especially if designing for presence? And I would like to point this question at you, Ottman, since you've been focused on a lot of the Crescent Bay demos that are here today.
So an interesting thing is that good VR makes computer graphics matter an awful lot. You have an incredible ability to perceive things in VR that you can't on a 2D monitor, even though there can be a lot more pixels on your 2D monitor. And so graphical quality matters. Using geometry and not using textures, all those things you can really appreciate. The downside of that is that where you cheat and lose, it's really bad. And the uncanny valley is a deep chasm that scares the hell out of me.
I mean, I've got much more tactical advice around.
I was looking for some more tactical advice, but
around aliasing, and that's the biggest complaint that I have when I look at the VR stuff. And the point about aliasing that might be acceptable on a 2D monitor really isn't in VR. And you need to make trade-offs, even if it's lower resolution, but you need to get a level of anti-aliasing in, which means you want MSAA is actually a better deal for VR than it has been for traditional gaming in a lot of ways. You want to be, we default to 2 on gear, and it's nice when you can use 4 if you're not that aggressive. But then the things that wind up being mistakes that developers make are seeing some things without MIP maps, so then a texture just aliasing horribly, something that's got high enough contrast that you really at least want to be using sRGB. And then presenting text is another one of the really common ones, where you want to use a nice thick text font to be able to, you don't want single pixel risers that are either aliasing or at least going through filtering in different ways as you project them onto the screen. So that's it's usually a good bet for me when I first try a VR experience. If there's not a ton of aliasing right away, it usually strikes me as certainly a more professional demo, and I tend to enjoy it more. And there have been a few cases when I've seen something that I really did kind of like, even though it had tons of aliasing, and I just want to get the developer and shake them and say, do these things and fix this.
Yeah, John didn't mention this, but part of the reason is that the displays are such low resolution, but the other part is that any aliasing you see is different in your eyes, and so you see stereo disparity where there's aliasing, and you just see all this popping and twinkling that's
like
very distracting. Yeah.
A low-res sparkle.
no other recommendations. Guys, thought we'd have some more there. Okay, we'll move on. What do you guys think it would take for VR to actually fail to take off this time?
Well, we usually try to take different planes, right?
We do.
I mean, there's the obvious, disaster scenarios in health and safety conditions that could happen, and it's probably not in our best interest to even really go into what could happen with that. But obviously, if people spontaneously combusted when they were in VR or had some similarly serious health issue, it would kill the industry. And there are things that you could trot out and say, I mean, what if there was a developmental problem with small children or something? That would be a tragic thing. And we can be as safe and careful as we want, but we're fundamentally doing something new that billions of people have not experienced before, that we don't have this history base to work with. So it's something that we should be conscious and cognizant of the risks with that. From a content side, at this point, I think we are over the hump, and it's smooth sailing in terms of getting it out, getting it to a lot of people. There's still a lot of little things that could trip us up, that could maybe make Oculus not the one that that gets overtaken by somebody else. But all signs look good right now. If it's not something out of left field catastrophic, I would be really shocked if 5 years from now VR is not a common, broadly used, wildly popular thing.
So I'm going to do something that I should know better to do by now, which is I'm going to disagree with John a little, because I don't think content is over that hump yet. I think that we haven't seen the thing that's going to cause people to have to use VR day after day because it's so compelling. And I hope someone in this room or someone watching is going to be the person who does that first. But while I've seen a lot of cool stuff, I haven't seen that yet.
So I actually think that I would agree with you on the game content side of things, but at this point, I'm enough of a believer that just the digitization and telepresence of the real world is going to be enough to make VR, that will be enough of a leg for VR to stand on, even if all the games failed, and they won't. There will be good games and bad games, and things will rise to the top. But if you look at if you watch grandparents using tablets to look at pictures of their kids, that's going to be magnified tenfold when you see, it's like, can I, when we get the little multi-camera ball that you can sit down there and then grandma can look at her granddaughter's birthday party or whatever, that's going to have this huge broad-based social thing where literally everyone in the world will see something that they'd like to do that is either a telepresence or a pre-recording of a panoramic stuff. I actually think that's enough by itself. And the games are all going to come on, and we've got this experimental stuff, and we don't know what the right things to do there are yet. But I also have confidence that that's going to get solved. And so I think the combination is why I feel really pretty good about it.
I also think network effects are going to be a really strong thing. I mean, people still play Team Fortress 2, not because it's necessarily, not to put it down, I've played a lot of it, but it's not necessarily the best game people could be playing, but it has a huge community of people who have been playing for years.
Right, but can we get enough network, enough people into the network on VR? And it's like, we're not there yet, but we
totally
probably
agree.
can be there soon.
I mean, if you look, we hope we can get there soon, because if you think about, to use a close example, Facebook, if you had shown it to somebody and said, do you think that billions of people will use this tool? If it had been, a profile with, a few friends, if, they weren't your friends, they weren't posting things interesting to you, I don't think many people would have instantly grasped that this was going to be a huge communication revolution. Virtual reality, if you have a lot of people, sharing experiences in ways that you can't experience any other way, and if you have ways to do things with people that are much more powerful than Skype or, or chatting on a telephone, I think that'll drive people to use it as well. But it's not clear. It's weird. You gotta get the people before you can keep the people, and vice versa.
Cool. So I did want to open it up so that some people here in the audience could ask questions. I think we've got about a little bit less than 15 minutes left. Are there questions from the audience? I think we have microphones up there. I see some people heading towards them. Right here.
Would you give us your thoughts on ambulatory VR? Specifically, walking around, what you guys might be working on, what you think about it.
The Oculus Rift is a sitting experience.
That's a good answer.
All right, next question.
What is Oculus's approach to their clear gender gap, and how you're going to not port that into VR?
So I will address this carefully. I noted that there were some people online, even an article pointing out that Oculus Connect is mostly male. I will point out that in the selection process, there were very few women that applied. It was not that we selected for males, and in fact, women may have actually come out ahead in the selection process by a very slight margin. I'm not 100% sure what we can do. This isn't a problem with VR. This is something that is widespread in the tech industry, and I don't think that virtual reality has any innate quality that really makes it immediately obvious that we're going to be the thing that has a lot more, women becoming interested in virtual reality and coming to developer conferences or becoming game developers. Then again, I'm not an expert on this issue. I don't really actually know what the best way to solve it. It's not something that I'm equipped to do.
We are having a hard time hiring all the people that we want. It doesn't matter what they look like.
Yeah. So I guess we'll just jump around here. So we'll go over there.
So all the most compelling experiences in the Crescent Bay demos we just saw are about creating these virtual worlds and putting you somewhere where you're really experiencing like a simulation, whether it's supposed to be realistic or not. But what about all the other things that I do on a computer all day, every day? It doesn't necessarily have to be as real and high fidelity, and yet a VR experience where we have incredible input and incredible feedback loops. Could that be a way we get people to want to use VR, even where we can't have them stay on the top of the Eiffel Tower and look down and convince them, yet still browsing Facebook or Twitter or whatever you do on a computer is so much better that you want to put on a headset?
All right, so I've spent a fair amount of effort trying to optimize legibility and readability in the VR headsets. Everybody since DK1 has always wanted these virtual desktops, and it was a disaster on DK1 with the full persistence and the low resolution. On It's still not good enough to do on DK2 with 1080p display. You'd be looking at something that's like an original iPhone size. On a 1440 system, you're basically you can do something credible in a 1K by 1K space, although it's still a little bit eye straining just because the optics aren't all that great. I think that when we get the next step and we've got 4K display resolution, then you're looking at simulating very large 1080p monitors, which becomes interesting as a desktop replacement, where you could have the potentially portable device that spins up your 32-inch monitors or whatever they'd wind up being at that resolution around you. And that becomes a genuinely useful productivity tool where you feel cramped on a laptop in a way that you're not used to if you use large monitors, and that will desktop replacement or monitor replacement will be credible on the next generation. It depends, next display generation, not necessarily next product generation. But it will depend to some degree on the quality of the optics. Right now, my torture test is reading these comic books in virtual reality, and it's something that I could spend an hour or something doing that, but I'm not sure at this point that I'd want to spend all day long inside the headset for a number of ergonomic and comfort reasons aside from just the visual fidelity. But I do think, not this year, but in years following, that is going to be a really big deal. And it may turn out that we sell more VR headsets for these mundane, prosaic uses of them as just a better way to carry all of your productivity rig around with you than necessarily for any of these VR-related aspects. So I think it's definitely not here now, but I can confidently predict it will be important within a couple years.
So I agree with all that, but I'll point out you need an input device too. Right? And so that's the other piece of the equation. How are you going to interact with that fantastic desktop?
So what I think you wind up doing there is the display should wind up changing so that you have removable light blockers, so that you can actually still look at a keyboard or some other traditionally interactive things. Because at that point, you're not trying to be immersed in a virtual world. You're trying to use it as a tool to sort of augment your space around you.
Alternatively, you could pull your keyboard and mouse into virtual space and track them.
Tactile matters for keyboards, more than a lot of things.
They're not virtual. It's a real keyboard.
Mm-hmm. Going back to his point before about...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, if you've got tracking for all of that, that's a good point.
Let's keep moving right here.
Hey, so kind of piggybacking off of his question, just interested in your thoughts on the future of UI, user interface, especially for things that really don't have an analog in the real world. Do you think we're trending towards skeuomorphic kind of interfaces where, like kind of what Make VR does, where you pick up a tablet in virtual reality and there's your menu or whatever? Or do you think we're going to have something like projecting a menu onto a 2D plane in front of you, kind of like what Team Fortress 2 does? Or do you think we're going to see a mix of both?
I don't think there's any obvious reason the long-term future is skeuomorphic stuff trying to emulate the real world. I mean, things like tablets exist because that's the best form factor we can cram the technology and the display into, not because it's what we would have invented if we had free reign to bring anything into this real world. I don't know if it'll necessarily end up being these really fantastical augmented reality movie-style interfaces, but it's probably not going to be real-world devices brought into the virtual world in the long term.
So, but I think one key aspect that I'd like people to think about when they're making VR user interfaces is that the real advance of VR over all of the other screens that we look at is that you can change your gaze view. Now, it's a bad idea to make something that forces you to look side to side, but as the glance of gathering information, I've made the comment that touching is the most natural way in the world to affect something, but glancing at something is the most natural way in the world to gather information. So I do think that good VR interfaces wind up, yes, you interact with everything right here, but we need to get away from sort of this safe zone mentality that so many designers have baked into them from all the time working on TVs and monitors, where it is well and good to extend well past the edges of the screen for information that you're going to bring forward around. So I think that, yeah, the notion about we have these limited boundaries on the physical objects because that's fundamental to their nature, and we shouldn't tie ourselves to that we should be able to do some things better. While we have to live with these lower resolutions and some of these other things, at least we can take some advantage of the wider field of view. But it's easier to overdo that by requiring people to change their gaze often.
I also think that like tablet interfaces, going back to that again, the reason that you tap on them and do these touchscreen motions is because that's the best you can do with a tablet. There's no reason that you don't have another element there where the confirmation isn't just touching something, but it's actually some depth. Like I've seen some interesting ideas where you can pull yourself through screens, not particularly like grab a handle and anything, but just being able to pull screens towards you and away from you, and that's not something you can do on a tablet. So that's another reason that interfaces probably aren't going to be these real-world analogs. I think we'll see some stuff that takes use of the primary advantage is looking around, but I think one of the other ones is that you have depth and that you can interact with UI elements that are transparent.
Once
and
we get good
have
tracking
depth.
of all of the
Yep,
stuff.
once we have tracking.
Yeah.
Over here.
So, oh my gosh, sorry.
Back.
Whoa!
So in the Crescent Bay, which was exhilarating and at times terrifying.
And just real quick, I don't want anyone to refer too much of the Crescent Bay demos in this room.
Oh,
so for the people that haven't, so no spoilers, but that's fine. Where you're going is totally fine.
Yeah. It brought to mind the early '90s and the whole Night Trap Mortal Kombat fiasco that led to the ESRB. And I was wondering if there were any thoughts you guys had with Oculus Share on some sort of self-regulating mechanism to warn people about the nature of experiences to forestall that kind of congressional scrutiny and maybe try to make sure everyone's on the same page with the level and depth of experiences that are.
Say the amount of curation we're going to exert is a fiercely debated topic in Oculus. So yes, there's a lot of strong opinions on the whole spectrum of options there, and right now we really don't know where we're going to wind up.
And I don't think that the ESRB is interesting and that it's voluntary and that it works for the current game system. But as we start having some kind of metaverse with people hopping between different places, between user-created content and commercial content and fusions of the two, the ESRB probably becomes not the right tool to police something like that. I don't know what the right tool is.
Well, you wind up with a lot of games that have ESRB levels, especially to the younger kids. It winds up adding a lot of technical limitations for how they have to mediate the communications between users. And those are certainly things that we have enough technical problems.
Sure.
I'd rather not have artificial ones imposed on us.
Well, and also, like with movies and games, it's traditionally been, it's what they say, what is present in this content? Is it violence? Is it sex? Is it drugs? Is it alcohol? And they check off all these things. But I could see making really terrible, horrible experiences that don't have any of those things, like something that drops you through floors or runs you through walls or has just really scary but not gory monsters. It's like, we're virtual reality is a powerful enough medium that you can probably make things that kids shouldn't be playing even without ticking any of those exact checkboxes. It's like was said earlier, I'll know it when I see it is the only way to really gauge that. The man won't keep us down.
I think I want to add one point from the product side. I think we already do some light curation on Share today to make sure that the experiences that are going up there are aligned with sort of what we would like to see on Share. So if someone does upload something that's completely out of line, violent or pornography or something like that, those things don't show up on Share. Those are curated out. So I think as John said, this is still a debated topic inside the company. I think it's too early to say exactly where we'll land on it, but it's a good question.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Over here.
Hey, Josh from TechCrunch. Earlier you said that controllers are the missing link, but implied that no one's really nailed it yet. Looking at dual-wielding nunchucks, motion tracking, and gloves, what are the advantages and disadvantages of those different input devices, and what would you guys say are your favorite?
Palmer, Ottman, Michael.
I don't think we got. I mean, that's a huge thing to get into our favorites and the.
We have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Sorry.
Just
next slide.
No,
how could you do that to me?
Something, Palmer.
What I'll say is that with virtual reality, you don't just want to have something that's optimized just for being nunchucks or swords. You want also a general purpose utility input device that you can naturally interact with the world with. And unfortunately, what makes a great gun controller is not the same as a great sword controller, is not the same as a great productivity controller or browsing controller. So it's a very difficult set of trade-offs to go through, and that's one of the reasons that I don't think we've seen one particularly ideal solution. It's because making a general device for for a problem like that is hard.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note that there's a lot of these things that, like, when I saw the low persistence demo for the first time, it took seconds. You're like, yes, this is absolutely the right thing to do. We have not had that moment on any input device where, it's clearly the right thing and we all agree and it's powerful.
Exactly.
So, Greg Roberts with D-Sky9.
Sneak in one more in, 30 seconds.
All right. First want to congratulate you all and thank you for actually bringing the industry to this point. It's really exciting to have seen the history and be here
Ask
now.
your question.
Okay. The question is, the killer app hasn't been invented, like you said, Michael. So what is Oculus doing, seeing as your future and all of our futures are depending on that to get it out there? What are you doing to really, besides this conference and bring the hardware, to seed developers and to allow and enable that killer app to be developed?
We're making the tools that enable the people to make anything ideally. And if you look at the real world, what's the real world's killer app? I think there's a lot of things. People haven't created it for VR not because they can't think of it, they can't imagine it. Science fiction's shown lots of great ideas for potential killer apps. But VR hasn't been around that long. This isn't something where people have been actively trying to solve it en masse for decades. I mean, in small numbers they have, but you haven't had rooms full of developers all trying to figure out killer apps. As time goes on, I think it's inevitable that someone will. I think there will be lots of killer apps, because if you can make a platform where you can do anything, how sad would it be if nothing is worth doing?
It would be sad if Oculus made the killer app. I mean, really, that's not what we're supposed to do. I mean, we do have first-party stuff that's being developed. I mean, we developed some of the Gear VR stuff, and there are teams spinning up to do things, but it would be really too bad if we were the only people out of everyone here that hit on the right idea. I would be disappointed.
I think it's unlikely as well.
Yes, I agree.
Because we can focus on ideas that we think are really good, and we have a lot of great people thinking about it, but really just through the sheer quantity of people that are tackling the problem outside of Oculus.
And there are limits even internally. I mean, there are thoughts and gestalts of ways of doing things inside Oculus that are precluding us from exploring some of the things that might wind up being important. I mean, it's the whole, when you have an organization, there is an organizational culture and an organizational way of doing things, and I think that there's a pretty good chance that we might not have the magic solution right now, that it's going to come from something with a different culture and a different way of going about exploring it.
On that note, we're going to wrap up.
Right after the next question.
No, I want to thank you guys all for coming. All these 4 brilliant minds will be here for the rest of the day today, so you can catch up with them, assuming they all come to the cocktail hour this evening and everything like that. We do have, I think, 9 developer sessions the rest of the day, starting, I think, in 15 minutes, which is why the next question was just cut. And so we hope you guys go explore those sessions. It's some of the top people from Oculus and third-party developers in the industry who are building VR games and applications. So thank you guys again for coming. It's awesome to have you guys here. Thank you.